Okay, dear all, so thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to this webinar on the Nordic countries and the future of women, peace and security. This webinar is organized by the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, in collaboration with the Peace Research Institute Oslo and the University of Oslo. My name is Jenny Lorentzen. I am a senior researcher here at NUPI. And in connection with the 25th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, Torunn Tryggestad from PRIO and Inger Skjelsbæk from University of Oslo and myself have edited a special issue for the journal Internasjonal Politikk, which was published in October 2025 with the title 25 Years of Women, Peace and Security in Nordic Foreign Policy. And today we have invited the contributors to this special issue to join us for a discussion on the future of the women, peace and security agenda from a Nordic perspective. So, over the past 25 years, the Nordic countries have been important supporters and drivers of the global efforts to promote and implement the women, peace and security agenda. And the Nordic countries have built significant status as leading actors in this field. However, today, there are several rocks in the sea for the future of this agenda. Internationally, we are facing major aid cuts, global setbacks against women's rights, and an increase in war and conflict. And the rapidly changing geopolitical landscape has also had a considerable impact on the security discourse and priorities in our regional neighborhood. It remains unclear how this will affect the status of the women, peace and security agenda in the foreign policy of the Nordic countries. So, will the Nordic countries remain progressive champions of the agenda, as in the past, or are we entering an era where the focus will be on defending the status quo? So, in this webinar, we will discuss this and topics such as what can we learn from the different approaches to women, peace and security of the Nordic countries over the last 25 years. Where does the women, peace and security agenda stand in Nordic foreign policy today? Will the Nordic countries have the ability and willingness to continue to play a leading role in advancing women, peace and security in the current geopolitical climate? And what can we expect from Nordic cooperation on women, peace and security in the years to come? So we will discuss these issues and more. And to join us in this discussion, we have Torunn Tryggestad from Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO, Inger Skjelsbæk from the University of Oslo. We have Marie Kolling from Danish Institute of International Studies. We have Louise Olsson, also from PRIO in Oslo. We have Silja Bara Omarsdottir from the University of Iceland. We have Minna Littikainen from the University of Helsinki. And then we were also supposed to be joined by Lena Vastapu and Elsa Hedling, who unfortunately had to cancel because of unforeseen issues. So, thank you so much. I will now give the word to Inger Skjelsbæk, who will provide a short introduction before we go to the discussion.
Thank you, Jenny, and nice to see you all. I'll just say a few words about the background here. As we all know, or many know, that in the year 2000, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And this happened in the context of an increasing focus on the human dimension of security, and in the aftermath of wars and genocide in the Balkans, in Bosnia, amongst those countries, and Rwanda, which exposed the extensive use of sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war. And the key message and commitment of Resolution 1325 is that women should be included in all work for international peace and security on all levels. That women's important contribution to conflict prevention and conflict resolution must be recognized, and that humanitarian efforts must have a gender perspective. Another important dimension of Resolution 1325 was the focus on recruiting more women into UN peacekeeping forces, and that a gender perspective should be applied in training, planning and implementation of peace operations. Resolution 1325, together with the 9 follow-up resolutions, today constitutes what we refer to as the Women, Peace and Security WPS agenda. So the agenda, we can say, paved the way for a new understanding, responses, and conversations about how we understand war and conflict as well as peace building. And I would argue also that criminal prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence is a major achievement in this regard. Despite this, there are those who claim that more could have been done and that implementation has been slow. There are also those who argue that increasing political polarization in other policy areas impacts the WPS agenda in profound ways. Some use the word pushbacks, others use the word backlash. Could it be that in the wish and the hope that more could have been achieved, and worries about the state of world affairs and outright attacks on the WPS agenda overshadows important changes that have taken place? And could there be a specific role for the Nordic countries to play, given that this normative agenda has had a central place in foreign policy in our region for the past 25 years, as Jenny also mentioned in her introduction? So in this special issue, we have gathered experiences from the Nordic countries, which have been important supporters of the WPS agenda throughout the 25-year period. The foreword is by Minister of Foreign Affairs in Norway, Espen Barth Eide. There's an introduction by the guest editors, and there are 9 different contributions that describe and analyze the Nordic countries' approach to WPS. 5 articles focus on the WPS agenda and what it has had, how it has played out in foreign policy in the various Nordic countries. And then there are 4 thematic articles discussing various aspects of the WPS work in the Nordic countries. All the articles are available and ready to read and to download freely from Cappelen Dam's website, their website on Internasjonal Politikk, also the name of the journal. There should be a link on the event page, apparently. I hope you can see it. And that's it from me. I'll now give the word back to Jenny, who will moderate the discussion.
Thank you so much, Inger, for that introduction. And just before we start, the logistics, you can ask questions in the Q&A throughout the seminar. We will take those questions at the end, but we will keep track and take note of them. So please don't hesitate to put them there as soon as they cross your mind. And also, just to clarify, those who are participating here today are not all the contributors to the special issue. We have 9 articles. Some of them are co-authored, so the list of contributors is actually even longer. And just wanted to express also my gratitude on behalf of our team of co-editors to everyone who contributed to this really, I think, amazing special issue, which I recommend everyone to download and read. So, thank you. Okay, then to start us off, I would like to ask some of you to start with an introduction to what you think characterizes the different approaches or main issues and characteristics of the approach to women, peace and security in the foreign policy of the different Nordic countries. So I would like to ask Torunn to speak about the Norwegian approach, Marie to speak about the Danish approach, Louise to say something about the Swedish approach, and Silja about Iceland's approach, and Minna about the approach of Finland. So I think, Torunn, you are very welcome to start.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thanks to everyone who signed up for this seminar. We are quite happy with this big turnout. And maybe I should add before I start, Jenny, that the journal, unfortunately, is in Norwegian only. So, so that's a sort of a drawback. But we've been thinking of whether we should try and make this also an English publication, because we think there might be a greater interest out there in the world to learn more about the Nordic countries and their role in advancing this particular agenda. Because there is, without doubt, I think we can say that all the Nordic countries, including Norway, that I will speak more detailed about, all the countries have played a very important role as norm entrepreneurs when it comes to developing this normative framework and also advancing it throughout these past 25 years. Norway, together with Sweden, actually was actively engaged on this topic, particularly the issue of increasing the number of women as peacekeepers already in the mid-1990s. So that was even before Resolution 1325 was adopted. So Norway and Sweden they were already then actively involved in both putting this topic on the agenda at the UN, but also to provide funding for, research and for civil society organizations' involvement in this. So when Resolution 1325 was adopted in October 2000, Norway was among the sponsors of this resolution. But what we can clearly see from our research is that Norway was not that particularly active in those early years when it comes to, actively following up on this resolution and initiating implementation efforts. But things changed when Norway then adopted its first national action plan in 2006. And Norway was actually the second country in the world to adopt a national action plan, only beaten by Denmark in 2005. But all the Nordic countries around this time followed suit. And I think this was a very important step because at least I remember the first years after the National Action Plan was adopted, there were a number of countries from outside of the Nordic region that came to the Norwegian government and came to us at PRIO to seek advice on how to develop a national action plan. So also there we can see that Norway and the other Nordic countries played an important role as norm entrepreneurs. Early on, and this I think is a particular trait with the Norwegian approach to the women, peace and security agenda. Early on, it was made quite clear that it was put a lot of emphasis on the women, peace and security agenda being about security politics. So responsibility for the advancement of this agenda should lie with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because this is about foreign policy. And I think this is also something that distinguishes Norway and maybe also the Nordic countries from many other countries around the world who typically leave responsibility for this agenda with ministries for gender issues or women's affairs. Whereas Norway all the time has emphasized that this is security politics, this is foreign policy. Norway's approach, I think we can say, has been, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has put emphasis on implementation efforts in different at different what should I say platforms or in different ways. Normatively, Norway has been very concerned about this being an agenda that we should look upon as a whole. The women, peace and security agenda has different pillars, so Norway has not been particularly concerned about just one or two pillars, but they have always emphasized, Norwegian diplomats, that we should look at this as a whole, that the different elements of this agenda are strongly interconnected. Politically and diplomatically, Norway has initiated and supported a number of different measures and activities. Typically, for instance, appointment of women into important positions, like the first NATO special envoy on women, peace and security, was initiated and funded by Norway. And also they have paid a lot of attention to, the advancement of women and gender perspectives in peace mediation and peace processes. And this is perhaps where Norway is particularly well known for its efforts. And throughout all its work, and particularly in relation to peace mediation, it's been very important for Norway to work with civil society organizations. And I think this is one other important characteristic or trait by the Norwegian policies in this area. Politically and diplomatically also, Norway has taken on important leadership roles globally, like most recently as co-chair together with Japan for something called the Women, Peace and Security Focal Point Network, which is a network of member states with focal points in their respective ministries that are working specifically on this agenda. Financially, Norway has never had a specific budget line associated with our national action plans, but still Norway has been a very important donor, not least to the civil society community, providing funding for a number of civil society organizations internationally, but also nationally. So in many ways, civil society organizations have become the operational arm of Norwegian foreign policy when it comes to the women, peace and security agenda. Institutionally, within the ministry or the foreign service, we see that there has been throughout all these years a focus on mainstreaming this agenda into all the different departments and sections of the ministry and also at the embassies. So the thinking has been that this is a responsibility of everyone to implement this agenda, not just one single person, although there have already for many years been one single person, a special envoy appointed to have sort of a particular overarching responsibility for coordination of different activities. And this emphasis on mainstreaming and the integration of women, peace and security as something that is a shared responsibility was something that we could clearly see when Norway was a member of the UN Security Council, and I will come back to this later. So in summary, I think I've been speaking already quite long now, some particular traits: focus on mainstreaming throughout the whole foreign service, the system, and consistency in approach. Norway has been working consistently on this over time, and the Norwegian government is regarded as particularly by civil society organizations as a partner that they can trust. Norway has been around even during the financial crisis, for instance. The level of funding to civil society organizations was the same. So it's been a trusted partner. So I think I'll stop there, Jenny, and leave the floor to the next speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Torunn, for a very good overview of the Norwegian approach. You mentioned in your introduction at the beginning that Norway, alongside Sweden, was working on this very early on. So I think it makes sense to hand the word over to Louise at this point. Please, Louise.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for organizing this event. I think it's a very current and very timely point to talk about this. As you have all stated, I mean, the Nordic countries have been entrepreneurs, and I think both taking stock but looking forward into how we can actually adapt WPS going forward is going to be central. And it also gave me an opportunity to sort of, in a sense, reflect on the 25 years I worked in the Swedish system, now also looking at it from the outside. And I think, I mean, it's very difficult to draw out the characteristics of this over the last 25 years in about 3 minutes. But I think what, so I'll just highlight a few key points and probably also looking at this in different phases. So Sweden was active and had an approach in the beginning of this, since many of the processes that goes into WPS, of course, comes out of Beijing and the push in the UN system to gender mainstream its efforts. And peacekeeping is, of course, one of those areas. It's the top priority at the end of the 90s. So Sweden's support to this effort to mainstream peace operations is sort of also what leads Sweden into, I would say, sort of supporting WPS from the outset. And I think a little bit of a difference between the Nordic approach and the Swedish approach has been that the Swedish has very much in that effort supported trying to understand, so how does gender affect the mandate? How is it related to the mandate implementation and the consequences on the ground? So trying to open up the conceptual understanding of what peacekeeping should do and what the consequences of that should be. So that is sort of one of the entry points. The other, I would say, core entry point that Sweden had was through gender mainstreaming in development aid, and then have a focus on civil society, women's participation and security in the context of particularly post-conflict aid. So I think that that's sort of where the foundation starts. And it's interesting because that means that in one way it also comes out of the sort of the national gender equality politics that has reflected over into foreign policy. And that also means, in a way, because gender equality policy in Sweden has been, up until the adoption of feminist foreign policy, more of a consensus-based area. So it hasn't. So I worked in the Swedish state system from 2008 to 2017, so across different kinds of governments. And working on WPS in that context didn't really vary that much. So the emphasis was about the same throughout the first decades. And it was very much a question of that also what Torunn described, sort of the mainstreaming approach. Now, when we approach the next phase, I would say, of WPS, which is when the emphasis shifts towards improving the understanding to more pushing for implementation and connecting this to bureaucratic processes that are supposed to then sort of create these results on the ground. Then Sweden also, for instance, uses collaboration with research to try to assess and also bring in other people, so other countries into this conversation as to what does it actually then mean to put this into practice? How can we build capacity? So Sweden has, for instance, during this time been very strong on supporting gender advisors and experts on gender equality in NATO, for instance, through the Nordic Center for Gender in Military Operations, and also in development aid, sort of directly targeting and supporting women civil society organizations. But I think with the shift towards the feminist foreign policy, 2014, we also see that this consensus start to change. So it becomes more closely associated with one political party, which also in a way affects how other parties start to position themselves on gender equality. Now, the benefits of the feminist foreign policy was, of course, that it actually went from being primarily a focus on a bureaucratic level with support by policy to being a political agenda. And that has pros and cons that I think would be very interesting to discuss further. But I think finally going into what I think is now when returning to the last phase of WPS work, when we're talking sort of the post-2015 period, what is interesting is that although gender equality and women, peace and security starts to become much closer together again, and they become a political priority, but they do so within foreign policy, and less so, although the priorities nationally shift to other kind of security concerns, which is of course related to their own national survival, and that is not pushed by either side of the political fence, which is also, I think, very interesting as to why that is. If you look at the latest defense decision, now you actually start to see a clearer articulation of many of the core issues where gender equality and WPS actually meet, that is then translated into that process. But I think for us as researchers, it does say something about what does it mean, that fact that we have developed the content on WPS for a time period that no longer basically exist. Like peacekeeping is going out, development aid is drying up, the priorities and the sense of urgency for our national security is overtaking a lot of different areas. So what does that mean for the principles of women, peace and security? Thank you. Sorry for talking too long.
Thank you, Louise, for the overview and also for raising very important questions. Okay, I think I would like to move on to Marie Kolling, who could, if you can say a few words about the Danish approach to women, peace and security. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, and also thanks to also Inger and Torunn. Thanks to all of you for organizing the special issue and this webinar. It's been really exciting to be contributing to this conversation. So speaking from the Danish perspective, I mean, it's a bit of a different story. So Torunn, you already mentioned that Denmark was the first country to adopt the national action plan back in 2005, and that certainly has contributed to the narrative around Denmark, championing the WPS agenda. But when we look at the 20 years that has passed, the agenda has been quite under-prioritized within Danish foreign policy. When the first NAP was adopted, it was the time when Denmark was preparing its bid for the UN Security Council. And WPS was one of the thematic priorities. And so I don't know if if Denmark was in a hurry to adopt the National Action Plan because it would be beneficial to the bid for the UN Security Council, or if we just got lucky. But yes, the fact is that Denmark was the first country to adopt the NAP, and The fifth NAP was launched last year, and that was certainly also, I'd say, the most comprehensive of the 5 NAPs. That was also adopted as Denmark, well, it was being prepared as Denmark was preparing its bid yet again for the UN Security Council. And so we see a pattern that when Denmark prepares its bid for the UN Security Council, the WPS agenda is prioritized a lot more and gains more prominence within the ministry. So that's something we can get back to later in terms of how to then maintain the momentum that we have right now, where it does receive more prominence than it has in the past. Because when we look at, I mean, the ministry's own evaluations, they do conclude that over the years, the WPS agenda hasn't been integrated into the policy work and strategies, being adopted across the ministry. So it has overall has very, the NAPs have had very little impact policy-wise, but also very little impact on the ground. And so there's a lot of work to be done yet. But I think the potential is there. I think the current NAP is indeed very comprehensive. It's also the first NAP where civil society has been fully included throughout the NAP cycle. So that's also been, I think, a very positive development, which has also impacted the content of the NAP. The interministerial group has been expanded. It now contains 6 ministries. Within each of the 6 ministries, there's a focal point that has been appointed. But again, yeah, so that also, so there's a more comprehensive structure in place, but still, I think compared to some of the other Nordic countries within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there isn't a WPS desk or a special envoy. There is a focal point, and that also says something about the resources allocated within the ministry to, to the work going into to WPS, and so within the ministry, I mean, foreign policy in Denmark overall sort of can be characterized by 3 different concerns. One is around security, another is around commercial interest, and then there's a third category, as we discussed in our article, me and my co-author, Lars Engberg Pedersen, which is sort of broadly like value-based policy. And curiously, WPS does not fall under the security domain. It falls under value-based policy. So that is everything to do with, human rights and democracy and gender equality, for example. But even within the work that has been going on at the ministry around gender equality, which over the years has been a priority, but WPS is not situated in the ministry under this domain of gender equality either. It really is its own agenda. And so it's also different focal points for gender equality issues and gender work and for WPS. And I mean, that, is very well. I mean, I'm sure there are very good reasons for doing it that way. So it's not that's not in itself a problem, but it just, I think, speaks to the issue around why the agenda has been so isolated. It's quite an isolated agenda within the ministry, and has really failed to become more integrated into the wider work going on across the ministry.
Thank you, Maria. Very interesting. Do you want to continue?
I mean, I can stop there for now. I think that was sort of the overall gist of it. That trying to give some insight into why it has been as under-prioritized as it has. Yeah.
Very interesting. And as you said, we will get back to how to sort of seize the moment later on. Let me give the word to Silja, who can say a little bit about the Icelandic approach to women, peace and security.
Thank you, Jenny, and my thanks to the editors and the organizers of the seminar. It's great to be here with you. So for Iceland, the passing of the WPS resolution in 2000 really coincided with some steps that had been made domestically to put gender equality on the agenda of Iceland's foreign policy. And that was mostly reflected in a contribution or secondment of gender advisors to post-conflict regions. And this was then sort of woven into the WPS focus as time went on. Iceland was also was an early adopter of a national action plan, and is currently in the 4th such plan, which was passed last year. And is valid until 2030. But what we've seen with those plans is that they have sort of not always been very effective. The first one in particular was very top-down, left out engagement of civil society. In the second one, civil society was engaged and participated in the shaping of the agenda. And that was probably in part because the then UNIFEM National Committee in Iceland had actually pressured the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to bring in training on WPS and to ensure that all seconded personnel had training on gender mainstreaming and training and were aware of WPS. In addition, Iceland, of course, has a unique status among the Nordic countries in that it doesn't have a military. So any secondments, there was an interesting time in the early 2000s when Iceland was sort of trying to be a good soldier, in quotes, contributing to NATO missions, and we're starting to contribute to ongoing conflict zones, like in Afghanistan. And there was an incident where Icelandic delegates were present near a bombing in Chicken Street in Kabul, and this sort of turned the tide, the attitudes domestically, and made the contributions to more maybe softer projects more desirable, and then this coincided again with the passing of the first NAP, and the NAPs have, as I said, they've sort of progressed from 2006 when the first one was established. And Iceland started to participate in proposing or supporting the later resolutions, but very much in any assessment that has been conducted, it showed that the staff either did not have an interest in or knowledge of WPS, and it became very isolated despite being promoted quite heavily by the Icelandic authorities. And yeah, I think that's sort of what we're seeing today, and maybe come back to a little bit later how the ongoing shifts in international politics are bringing us from having this focus on post-conflict contributions to participation in or support for ongoing operations, and maybe more focused on defense and security rather than on peace or peace building, which was the priority very early on. The secondment of gender advisors was very prominent, and in the last few years, what I think we've seen in particular is that has been spread out, or sort of because Iceland often prioritized the involvement of men, and with its service now in the Human Rights Council, it's also focused very much on LGBTQ issues, which of course are not necessarily a part of the WPS agenda, but it's sort of as a way of promoting or identifying or creating a unique identity in the broader field of gender equality. But then, yeah, I think maybe later we can come back to sort of the defense and security versus peace and security changes that I think we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you, Celia. And yes, we absolutely will come back to that. And thank you also for, I mean, what I find so interesting about this work is also to see the particularities of the different Nordic approaches. So last but not least, I will give the word to Minna, who will talk about the Finnish approach to women, peace and security. Please.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. So just a few words about the Finnish approach, a lot of similarities to what we've already heard. So I would say Finland also has been a champion of the WPS agenda in one way or another since at least the 1990s. When we were writing this article with my colleague Leena Vastapuu, we were like almost a little bit struck ourselves to realize how much leadership there was by very specific kind of senior political leaders from Finland in the 1990s and the early 2000s that then led to the WPS agenda and its kind of imagining what it could be. So these included the presidents Martti Ahtisaari and Tarja Halonen, as well as the former defense minister Elisabeth Rehn, who of course was the co-author of the early UNIFEM report. The name escapes me, but around women and conflict. So in that sense, we thought of kind of individualized leadership in the early years. If we look at the foreign policy establishment, that started more clearly with the first National Action Plan in 2008. So just after all the Nordic neighbors, and Finland also now is on its fourth National Action Plan. The way we looked into kind of the history of women, peace and security in Finnish foreign policy was very much through the National Action Plan, seeing what's remained the same and what does some of the changes in those National Action Plans tell us. And actually, the programmatic sectoral focus areas pretty much have remained the same. At least the kind of titles, the headings have remained the same, although probably content has shifted a little bit over the almost 20 years. But you could basically say there's three different programmatic focus areas. One that's been there since the beginning is kind of peace mediation or peace negotiations, something that Finland, I guess, has seen as an important part of the women, peace and security work since the beginning, but particularly a bit more recently, I think around the 2020, the MFA set up a new center for peace mediation. So there's some move in Finland to try to brand peace mediation more part of Finnish foreign policy, and in a way, I guess, develop the expertise on these issues. So women's participation has been included there. But this is the area, the programmatic area in the NAPs that actually most clearly relies on the work of NGOs, the expertise of NGOs, and the actual implementation of NGOs. So while the government policy is to promote WPS as a part of peace mediation, it seems that it tends to go through the NGO projects most of the time. The second area is crisis management, and this is the area where you might say that where there's maybe been the most kind of vitality, to use Laura Shepard and Paul Kirby's word. So vitality in terms of a lot of quite even hands-on thinking around how to improve women's participation particularly in civilian crisis management, and some results for years now. And obviously there's an area also that you can follow through quantitative indicators, so it's easy to report on results. But you know, Finland has seen that it's been able to recruit usually between 40 and 50% of its civilian crisis management personnel have been women, and that it's a pretty good achievement because they do calculate the police officers and the seconded border officials as well into this number, so it's a decent achievement. But then the other side on the civilian on the crisis management piece, of course, then is the military crisis management, where Finland really struggles to send women personnel. That it has probably, the numbers have doubled, but it's still at about 4%, and it of course just reflects the Finnish military, Finnish defense forces, and how few women there are overall in that institution. And then the third area that I'm kind of lumping all together, but it's a kind of areas around kind of peace building or post-conflict reconstruction, which then is seen more through development policy, through development programming. So these are the programmatic areas. And then, of course, I think what we don't see in the NAP so well is then the kind of work in international arenas, which is one place where Finland does like to work on WPS, but it's not something that we see so much in the policy. Just to kind of round off this short introduction, I was just reflecting a little bit on the topic of today's webinar and thinking about this kind of progressive champion or defender of the status quo type of question that's in our title. And I would say on balance, I think Finland is more of a defender of the status quo, particularly in this Nordic peer group, even though there is that type of vitality, there is activity, but in terms of the substance, it tends to be a little bit more on the conservative side. I mean, some of the more progressive aspects include, for example, the NAP process itself. So it is very kind of interdepartmental, and NGOs and civil society have been part of it. Maybe not the whole time. Well, in some ways the whole time, but for several iterations now, there's been quite, I think, meaningful engagement with civil society. And I think on the whole, Finnish officials themselves and a lot of the international partners as well see Finland as a kind of a reliable and a pragmatic partner on these issues. So there is a certain kind of progressiveness there, but also that type of pragmatism that then some partners may appreciate. But then what keeps it in the conservative camp really is this, of course, like comparing especially to Sweden, is this avoidance of any kind of feminist branding, no matter what government there is in power, and this kind of a prioritization even before 2022 of this continuity in foreign policy, so that any kind of foreign policy platforms need to be something that are kind of palatable for any potential coalition government, any potential foreign minister who comes from any political party background. So that seems to be one of the reasons why there's been this more conservatism in foreign policy. And actually in our article, we argue that women, peace and security is very good for this, because the gender framing in women, peace and security is quite conservative. It talks about women, and it's something that can also be used. You can use it in a kind of progressive sense, or in a very kind of more status quo oriented sense, if you want to talk about women. So it works that way also for Finnish foreign policy. But I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minna. And this is so interesting. And I think, this has also shown, of course, the variety amongst the Nordic countries. But of course, also, as I said in my introduction, that the Nordic countries are also collectively known for being champions of the women, peace and security agenda. I think there is this association. And of course, the feminist foreign policy of Sweden maybe is something that really contributed to this image, and which has left a mark, I think, internationally, and still does, because we have seen many countries outside of the Nordic region adopting feminist foreign policies since then. In the interest of time, I think perhaps we should move on and talk a little bit more about what also came up during your introductions, because one arena that has been very important for the Nordic countries' efforts to promote women, peace and security is as elected members of the UN Security Council. So a question then is, what did Sweden and Norway achieve as elected members in 2017 to 2018 and 2021 to 2022 respectively? And how is Denmark prioritizing women, peace and security as an elected member in 2025 and 26? So to talk about this, I would like to start with giving the word to Louise.
Thank you, Jenny. And I agree. I mean, it's really fascinating to see how states that are very, very similar still have their own sort of national approaches to this. And I think that also comes across in this question of how do we, in a sense, act in the Security Council. And interestingly, Norway actually financed a study of Sweden's term as Norway was going in, which allowed us to develop I think a model in order to try to understand what does it actually mean for a state to push WPS, because I think that's a foundational aspect. And I think we can see that in a sense of different kinds of tools, everything from sort of improving the understanding and sort of the alliances on WPS, so sort of building the foundation to adopting new resolutions, to adapting the working methods, to integrating WPS aspects, or very concrete aspects, into everyday language, and also then at sort of the end of the spectrum, pushing for following up on actual implementation then of these decisions. And I think here the feminist foreign policy was really critical from the Swedish perspective, because that meant that there was a support and credibility from the political level all the way down to the bureaucratic and to the high level decision makers in the Security Council, and also bureaucratic capacity building as Sweden went into its term, which meant that it worked very hard to really translate sort of the policies into practical everyday decisions. And that was also, if you heard the special representative Olof Skog talk before about his term, he really had this political mandate to actually at every meeting bring it up. However, his assessment from the top leadership level was that in order to make that work, we have to make it very concrete for each specific file. So Sweden, in a sense, developed concrete understandings of what WPS meant for each of the items on the security agenda, and then pushed that through the different debates. And I think in the assessment we made, we say that makes Sweden sort of predictably unpredictable. It meant that every state knew in the council that Sweden was going to bring up WPS. However, it wasn't clear what they were going to bring up, which meant that the other states, if they had other interests or if they wanted to support the position, also have to adapt. So in a sense, it was an interesting way to work with this sort of translating this very, very large abstract norm into very concrete daily practices. And I think another way to do that was, of course, that they worked to ensure that women's civil society organizations were also included in the actual debates. If you look at data on women's representation in Security Council debates, it was very common prior to 2015 that they were included, women's organizations were included when you were talking about women, peace and security. However, the next day when we were talking about Cote d'Ivoire or about Haiti or about Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were no women's organizations representative. But I think it's also very important to say that Sweden here also supported what was already an existing global trend coming out of the global study, right? So these were demands by women's civil society organizations to be included. And there was also demands by civil society and the UN structures to include language in everyday decisions. So it really sort of capitalized on that. But I think it was also important to say that these were difficult times, but I think it will be very interesting now to learn from Denmark, because there were still openings and it was less polarization on WPS. And I think Denmark is up against a much, much tougher. And I think Norway, as Torunn will also say, started to meet those kind of challenges already.
Please, Torunn, go ahead, because I guess as Sweden was leaving its seat on the Security Council, Norway was probably already planning its campaign.
Yes, definitely so. And I think this is something that is quite intriguing by the Nordic collaboration, not only on women, peace and security, but on a number of different issues. This close collaboration when Nordic countries are campaigning for a seat in the UN Security Council, there is this tradition of supporting one another. And once Sweden was elected and became a member of the UN Security Council, it was already decided that Norway would be the next candidate. And what Norway did then was actually to place a diplomat at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Stockholm, working with the UN Security Council team there, not as an observer, but as a fully integrated diplomat. And the same happened during Norway's period in the UN Security Council. Then there was a Danish diplomat in Oslo. So there is this process of learning from one another and exchanging, experiences, which I find quite fascinating, not least on women's peace and security. And women, peace and security was one of Norway's 4 priority themes for the Security Council period, and it was also very central to their campaign for election to the UN Security Council. And once elected, Norway really picked up the baton from Sweden, as Louise pointed to. Norway worked on more or less the same topics or use the same methods, focusing on, how to integrate language on women, peace and security in mandate renewal for peace operations, for instance, whenever there were new resolutions negotiated on new topics. They were working on this. Norway had high ambitions, but the Norwegian diplomats were really up for a difficult start, not only because as tensions were rising because of the geopolitical situation, and we saw Norway enter the Security Council at a time when tensions between especially Russia and China was growing, including on women, peace and security, but also the fact that Norway entered during the pandemic. So at least for the first half year, all meetings happened online. And this made it quite difficult for Norwegian diplomats, because one of the, what should I say, strengths of Norwegian diplomacy, at least they argue themselves that one of their strengths is the informal, diplomacy, often by us academics referred to as the waffle diplomacy, that you make waffles and invite representatives from other countries to eat waffles and drink coffee. And this is how Norway then builds alliances and talk informally and build trust. So this was very difficult for the Norwegian diplomats during those first months of the Security Council period. But again, working very similar to how Sweden did it, focusing on how to slightly reform working methods, the everyday decision making. They worked very much on building alliances and collaboration, particularly with the other elected members, and maybe particularly Ireland and Mexico. They installed this system of something called the Statement of Shared Commitments, where when members then enter the UN Security Council, you sign on a commitment that you as a member will work to integrate, gender language in text. You will work to have more women as briefers in the UN Security Council. This was also very important to Norway. And Norway also promoted the Women, Peace and Security agenda during their presidency, and when they organized this, what is often called signature events. That's where you can, take the opportunity to highlight particular topics of importance to you. And Norway, for instance, brought up the issue of protection of women, human rights defenders and peace builders. And I think this was the first time that this was a topic that was brought to the formal agenda of the UN Security Council. So, the UN Security Council as a platform, very important also to Norway in advancing this agenda and building very much on the work already done by Sweden and the platform that Sweden had, sort of laid out for Norway in a way. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Torunn. And I guess the Norwegian membership also was at the time when the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place in 2022. And since then, the work in the Security Council has become more challenging. I think we can safely say that. And now Denmark has its elected seat in the UN Security Council since 2025 and also in 2026. And Maria, would you like to say a few words about how this is now playing out for Denmark and how they work with women, peace and security in the Security Council?
Yes. Overall, there was certainly an ambition to work with women, peace and security and to put the principles of women, peace and security into practice on the council. That was the statement from Denmark when it joined the council. But yes, the situation in the council is very complicated. As we all know, some of the permanent members are not prioritizing WPS at the moment. So that work is incredibly complicated. And that'll definitely be sort of the official explanation as to why Denmark has achieved so little, if anything at all, actually, when it comes to really making a mark with regard to the women, peace and security agenda. But I would add, though, that, of course, the current situation in the council is, that is complicated. And the struggle is just to be able to even, have women, peace and security mentioned in statements, for example. But still, to the best of my knowledge, at least, there wasn't, it's fascinating to hear all the work that have been going on in Sweden and Norway before joining the council and in preparing the bids, because, and to really have like strategies ready for, how to work with women, peace and security. And that doesn't seem to have been the case. In Denmark, there wasn't, there was never any official sort of strategies that were presented or like outlines of like, this is what we're going to do, like, sort of, specific ways that Denmark was going to work with women, peace and security on the council. And also in my interactions with people at the ministry, that was also the message that I received, that there wasn't actually, these very specific plans for how to go about it. So it seems to me that that also did not help in these difficult times, if we can put it like that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I think we can also say that those international changes and challenges that are affecting the work in the Security Council are also very much affecting our own region. And so if we move the discussion sort of back to the Nordic neighborhood, I think a very important question is how is the changing security situation in our regional neighborhood affecting discussions around women, peace and security in the Nordic countries? And I would like to hear from Minna and also others about this, but I would like to let Minna start here.
Great, thank you. What has changed? A lot has changed over the last, well, almost 4 years now. But if we think about, in terms of Finnish WPS policy, of course, the war in Ukraine, and then Finland's own application and NATO membership have been the most important changes probably that have affected WPS policy. And these are, of course, changes that have reprioritized kind of hard security in an unprecedented way in recent history. And historically, of course, as I mentioned earlier, women, peace and security hasn't been very well integrated into Finland's hard security policy, defense policy, or the Finnish defense forces. So even if the situation is difficult at the moment, already the basis didn't exist even before. So what in this research that I report in this article, but also other work that I've done in recent years, I've identified kind of several contradictory dynamics that I try to mention here now for you. So probably the major dynamic is just the kind of utter marginalization of the women, peace and security agenda. So again, sectors that don't really typically integrate women, peace and security have gained major prominence. On the other side of that, we're seeing the squeezing of the space and resources that are available for development policy, development programming, peace mediation, as well as NGOs of all kinds, but especially peace NGOs. So all of these type of women, peace and security adjacent spaces and resources have really been squeezed. And I think that's one of the major factors driving the marginalization of WPS. Now that's the overall pattern. Then there are some kind of smaller patterns that either go along with it or slightly contradict it. One interesting thing that's come along with NATO membership is that that's actually driven in a small way for Finland to think about how to take women, peace and security agenda into defense policy and into the Finnish defense forces. So while Finland has had this profile internationally that I described earlier as a champion of the women, peace and security agenda in various spaces, including in its a kind of collaboration with NATO previously, once Finland became a member, I think there were some actors who were a little bit surprised that there are these requirements, I don't know if that's the correct word, but certain kind of NATO standards around women, peace and security and around kind of NATO's policy around gender in military operations that Finland had to take a bit more seriously now. So we have seen some changes in the Finnish Defence Forces, for example. They have recruited a gender advisor, which I understand is for the first time ever. I don't think they are in a full-time role, but still to have a formal gender advisor role 25 years after 1325 was adopted is a major shift. So NATO, in a way, hard security on the whole, bad news for women, peace and security, but then this kind of NATO membership does have this flip side that NATO actually has quite strong policies and structures for women, peace and security that now Finland has to take seriously because it's coming from such an organization. Having said that, from what I have seen and from my discussions with various officials and others, is my understanding is that Finland does not see women, peace and security as something that is part of Finland's profile as a new NATO ally. So of course we see a lot of activity in the foreign ministry, in defense ministry, in think tanks, thinking about what does Finland as a new NATO ally look like? What should it be doing? Where should we put our kind of expertise and resources? Women, peace and security is missing there, or is in a very marginal role, if at all. So that kind of supports the marginalization narrative. Now, if we look at women, peace and security policy rather than Finland's security policy and NATO membership profile, there's some changes. I mean, the latest National Action Plan is from, I think, 23 or 24. It's pretty recent, and you do see the changing security situation and the NATO membership application somewhat reflected in the language there. One topic that is flagged there, as well as in some of the interviews I've done with NATO officials, is this notion of comprehensive security or societal security. So that could be one area where Finland seems to have kind of, my lights timed out. So comprehensive security is another kind of policy area that Finland does have some kind of political capital, especially within NATO. So there seems to be some interest in developing this maybe as an area of bringing women, peace and security and societal security together. But as far as I know, there isn't any practical implementation there yet, but something to look out for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minna. And of course, NATO membership represents a big change in the foreign policy of Finland, but also of Sweden. And perhaps, Louise, would you like to also add a bit on how this has affected the way Sweden works on women, peace and security, or the discourse as such?
Yeah, because I think it's I think one way to be, one concern is what Minna brings out, is sort of the actors and the norms and the cultures that are very much associated with national security has gendered implications that are potentially very negative. And I think for Nordic countries where gender equality is and should be, and we have fought long and hard to have it as such, it is something we need to fight to maintain a focus on, to push back on that negative aspect. And I think another thing, though, I don't think we should underestimate, is that if you think of WPS not only as a normative shift, but something that is a decision that should also be sort of translated into practice to handle very specific problems, like women's exclusion from decision making on security issues, like women's security concerns not being prioritized and given enough resources to be addressed, to not thinking through thoroughly how the humanitarian and sort of the political, sort of the larger economic and political consequences of armed conflict have effects on gender roles and gender equality in a society. Those have not really been translated into practice within our own context, connected to our gender equality work, and also then connected to very practical decisions. And I think if we think that WPS took 15 years to do this, to succeed in even getting close to that. I think maybe it is also a chance to, like Minna were saying, maybe we should also here think through how do we actually make sure that those principles are becoming more explicit, more articulated, and better understood. Because right now, I completely agree, WPS seems to be very much associated with international operations, with peace processes, with peace building. And I mean, they are still so we need to maintain that focus. We should continue to support women's civil society organizations in conflict areas. But I think we also need to take very seriously how are then women in Sweden, in Norway, in Finland, how are we part of the decision making in areas that have substantive impacts on how we live our lives, how the different priorities are. And that is something that WPS speaks very much clearly to. But I think in order to actually make that happen, we need to be much more concrete about what the issues are, what the situations are, and really contribute to assist to make that more concrete. And I think I was reading through the last defense decision in Sweden just the other day, and you're starting to see an embryonic formalization of that. It's not articulated as women, peace, and security necessarily always, but it does talk about women and men if we use them as categories to understand potential impact of armed conflict. You start to see that there is some understanding that that's going to have different health effects, different violence effects. It's going to have different effects on how the infrastructure is affected by a war, etc. So you start to see some indications of that. You start also to understand that if you look at population surveys, and women have been the group that have not formed a decision on defense, that is actually a problem. And I think, like Torunn and I have repeatedly seen, I mean, I don't think we've ever seen so many male-dominated panels talk about our security as we did when the security shift came, although we have been preaching to all other states around the world how important it is that women and men are always represented in these debates. So I think we have an opportunity to live as we preach now, but we need to take that very much seriously instead of operating with a lot of assumptions, which we tend to do at the present moment, which is, as Clint Eastwood has said, assumption is the mother of all screw-ups. So I think we really need to try to learn from what research actually taught us about armed conflict and the effects of gender at this present time. And I think we need to be much more active in that debate.
Thank you, Louise. I agree, absolutely. And I would also like to give the word to Silja and hear a bit about how this is experienced in Iceland.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, it's been a very interesting few years in Iceland as well as in, all of the Nordic countries, of course. But the shifts that we've seen in NATO, they've definitely, the impact of the war in Ukraine has definitely been felt here, even if it's in a bit of a different way, with Iceland being a founding member of NATO. As I said, it remains the only unarmed member country. Well, what we've seen very much since then is a strong shift towards, like Minna was saying, this sort of that the focus has gone from societal security, from softer approaches to security, to very hard militarized definitions and approaches. And one of the what I think is most interesting is how we've seen a shift. Where if we go back and look at it, like I do in my article, what sort of brought out the emphasis on gender equality in Iceland's foreign policy has roots in a very feminist, pacifist culture of the women's list that was active in Icelandic politics in the 1980s and 90s. And what we see now is sort of leaning into militarized actions. For the first time, Iceland supported weapons purchases for Ukraine, could not send weapons. This was stated explicitly by our Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time. Iceland, as an unarmed country, could not buy weapons itself to send to the Ukrainian military, but supported NATO efforts to do that with financial contributions. And buying military gear that is purposely fitted for women was defined as a gender equality supporting project. So we've seen the shift from maybe peace and security to defense and security, and that has been accompanied by, for the first time in September last year, there was a proposal for a defense and security strategy tabled in the parliament. It still hasn't been passed, but in the proposal itself, so in the text of the policy or the strategy, there's no mention of gender equality or the importance of WPS. And there are, I think, 4 mentions of anything to do with gender or women in the text itself. And that is just to say that when contributions are increased to NATO, that gender perspectives are taken into consideration. And I mentioned before that Iceland had sort of started its contributions to WPS or to integrate gender equality in its foreign policy by seconding personnel, and that was very much to UNIFEM, later UN Women, to projects that had a gender focus. Now there are about 15 Icelandic personnel working for NATO in the US and Brussels shape, or in the Baltic countries, and they are all working on sort of militarized projects. And so this shift has been very prominent, and trying to mention that maybe we need to take a responsibility for including including the gender perspectives in our own policies is not taken it's not well received, I think, and so it's difficult to say that we should domesticate these projects. And actually, I forgot to mention one thing in the new strategy, in the new National Action Plan. Sorry, one of the main missions of that policy is on gender perspectives in national security and defense, and that action is sort of defined as making more of an effort to highlight the contributions of women in Iceland's security and defense and promote women role models to increase women's participation and foster positive attitudes towards women in this field. So it's not about integrating gender equality or about promoting the WPS agenda as such, but creating a positive attitude towards women participating in defense and security. I think that's where we've seen a very clear shift over the last few years.
Great, thank you, Silja. And I can see that time is flying, and personally, I think we could continue this discussion all day. But we also promised to touch a little bit upon the future. And I think I haven't seen any questions from the audience so far. But so maybe we can move to give each of the participants 1 minute to talk a little bit about what topics or issues should the Nordic countries focus on going forward, or what should be prioritized in the coming years. Like, what do you think? What role do you think the Nordic countries can play in the future, and how? So let me start with Maria, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, I think in the very short term, in the Danish context, I mentioned the Denmark launched its 5th NAP in April last year, but we're still to see the implementation plans. When the NAP was launched, there was no implementation plans. They were still in the making, and so to the best of my knowledge, they're still I don't know if they're still in the making or if they're just not published yet, but at least they haven't been made available. And so, yeah, and I think that's that's incredibly important, because they will show exactly how to implement the NAP, right, and who's accountable for what. And that's an incredibly important tool for actually implementing this comprehensive NAP that was adopted, right? So that's definitely something that I'll be keeping my eyes on, or keeping out for, and also the continued dialogue with civil society and how that moves forward, which I think has been a great improvement as well, and very important. part of this current process. But then overall, I think also, yeah, I'll definitely also be curious as to whether Denmark will maintain the momentum, because yeah, this increased attention towards WPS had a lot to do with Denmark making its bid for the non-permanent seat on the Security Council. So, you know, what will happen once Denmark leaves the council? Will the ministry maintain its priority on WPS? You know, hopefully it will, because there is so much more work going on now. But that is, of course, a concern. Also because we saw with the Danish EU presidency last year. Denmark had the EU presidency from July to December, and WPS was not a priority at all within all the work that was going into the presidency. Although security was on top of the agenda, Denmark is right now going through a huge rearmament moment, boosting its defense in all kinds of ways. So security is on the agenda, but despite all of this, and Denmark being such a firm supporter of Ukraine as well, and so much work going into that, WPS is still not part of all of that of these discussions. And so it's not, of course, work is going on, but again, just this failure to integrate it into these broader security strategy, which shows how it is a very marginalized agenda within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also very much within the Ministry of Defense. But yeah, the Nordic countries across the board do have a role to play, because it is still an agenda that is here and alive. And I mean, seeing some of when we saw the launch last year, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, he launched the new National Action Plan very enthusiastically, being very committed to the agenda and having Denmark championing this agenda. But but we're still waiting to see in what ways and if this will continue its momentum. Yeah.
Thank you. And yes, absolutely agree. I will give the word next to Minna.
Okay, thank you. Such a difficult time to think about kind of in a future-oriented way, but I'll probably just touch on a few of the items that I've already mentioned, that I think are important, like for Finland and then for Nordic countries as some sort of collective as well. So, well, I think one really is to, in some way, to try to safeguard those kind of WPS adjacent spaces that are under so much threat now, whether it's peace mediation, development policy, development programming, especially development programming that is not directly tied to like foreign trade goals, because that is another trend that is very much growing. And then the role of civil society and of NGOs. It seems like that space is really being squeezed in our countries at the moment as well. And for Finland, it certainly feels that since Finland became a member of NATO, that at least some people seem to think that then all of these things aren't important anymore, that somehow they were just something we did when we weren't military aligned. And that's maybe something that Finland could learn from other Nordic neighbors that have been NATO members for a long time and maybe haven't had this kind of a stark kind of black and white thinking around these kind of peace mediation or development goals. Then the NATO question does have to be tackled in some way or another that doesn't fully kind of co-opt or militarize the WPS agenda even further. I mean, NATO itself, of course, is now really rethinking its approach to women, peace and security within this changed as geopolitical situation, dealing with the same challenges as the Nordic countries, that women, peace and security and gender was very much part of the kind of overseas military crisis management missions, and the way we thought about peace and security and about gender in those contexts is very different than how we think about peace and security and or gender in the context of the kind of NATO's first goal and task, which is the defense and deterrence. So that work is happening within NATO, and I'm sure some Nordic countries are part of shaping that. But that seems to be an important place where it would be important to have good expertise and good voices there around the table. And just overall, I mean, we need to build a women, peace and security that reflects better what peace and security means today, and a specific policy area might be around comprehensive security or total defense or societal security, or resilience, however we call it in the different countries. That could be an entry point. I'm not saying it's a perfect one, but given that there is relatively good amount of interest, both nationally and as a kind of global policy issue, at least NATO or Europe-wide policy issue, that could be one place to start developing it. And I would say from a Finnish perspective, I think Finnish actors, both state and non-governmental and researchers, really benefit from Nordic collaboration. I think other types of collaboration would be important, I think, in a changing world, but this kind of, the importance of the Nordic alliance is as important. Yeah, they're as important as ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minna. Silja?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I think a little bit of what I was getting at the end of my last intervention was sort of this: how do we make sure that we are accepting responsibility for the WPS agenda in our home countries, and not just something that we want to push on conflict-ridden zones of the world or developing countries, which has often been sort of an underlying tone in discussions about this strategy. So I think it's saying that when we are developing our policies, when we are addressing changes such as the ones that we're seeing in Finland and Sweden with recent membership of NATO, that we are taking the gender perspectives, that we are taking WPS seriously is very important. And I don't remember now who mentioned it. Maybe it was Louise. How the WPS, when it was written originally, really had roots in domestic political culture in I think it was Sweden then. That we have the gender equality built into our democratic systems in some way. Of course, it's something that we need to defend in the current environment, but that we take advantage of that, and as Nordics, that we accept responsibility for holding those values high in the future.
Thank you, Silja. Torunn?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think the Nordic countries have really benefited from this post-Cold War liberal moment in building status and on a number of issues, because we have been able then to promote globally norms and values that are really at the core of the norms and values of our respective countries. So I think this has been very important to the Nordic countries in building international global status, including on women, peace and security. And I think now with the current geopolitical situation, we are really up for a test. and I think we are challenged in terms of what is now the Nordic, what should I say, identity. I think, at least in Norway, women, peace and security is still a priority, but it's more a question about how likely or how possible is it now to really advance this agenda in the current situation, because it's becoming more and more difficult. We are really, really challenged, especially when it comes to peace mediation and peace facilitation, where Norway has really established itself as a leading country. And now, in my experience, Norway's put more and more in the back seat, because there are other actors now rising to prominence, and countries from the Middle East, countries that does not, pay much attention, or at least do not emphasize women, peace and security as much as we have done. I fully agree with Silja and Minna and also Louise. I think we really need to look at how the Nordic countries can work together in advancing this agenda also now in this, growing awareness around the total defense concept, building societal resilience, societal security, because this is something that is now emerging more and more. And it's also becoming part of the Norwegian National Action Plan, the most recent one, as a sort of a new topic, that we need to bring the women, peace and security agenda back home to national politics. And thus far, I haven't seen many traces of this actually happening in practice. But I think that there will be changes now taking place, maybe as of this year. And in Norway, 2026 has been defined as the year of total defense. So there will be a lot of, activities and attention being paid to this. So I think this is where maybe the Nordic countries now have a moment to work more closely on issues like these. And maybe promote this approach also within the context of NATO, if NATO continues to exist. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Torunn. And Louise?
Yeah, just to continue to build on that, I have two. Since my chapter in the special issue is about the role of research collaboration and in critical moments of the decision making, I have two very concrete suggestions for any policymaker with resources that are out there. The first one, I think, is that we should do a study collecting the lessons learned on how to preserve, how to collect and identify some of the core lessons we have as a region learned on peace processes, on peace building over the last 25 years, and also in that sense then help identify new innovative ways to continue to promote particularly civil society organizations in conflict areas. And I know, Jenny, you have done a lot of really good work on that already, so I could see us doing that in a sense on a more regional level. The second one is that on a positive note, in a very dire situation, I'm part of the Swedish Armed Forces have over the last 6 years trained about 150 of its most senior officers on women, peace and security and gender equality in a program that stretches over a year, and where they also translate this knowledge into practice. And that really highlights a lot of the core challenges I think that we stand for if we want to translate this policy into our own region. And now also thinking, because yes, we need to push, of course, in NATO together, because that's also a very difficult political situation at the moment. But I think we would be in a much better position to do that jointly if we, since we are now one operating region, like under one NATO headquarters, right? So we're one area where we can think of what are the WPS aspects that are more central to our region, and what are our expectations in terms of how those should actually be handled in a practical way, given a worst case scenario. And based on that, we can push WPS also with credibility towards others. And I think but then also drawing on another core lessons learned that we all had, and that is that it has to be done by the core decision makers ourselves. It cannot be done by our experts. Expertise should support leadership, but it has to go through that. So what are our leaders, like comparing and discussing with leaders in our different countries and also building that into these scenarios? Because I think we need to shift the focus from recognizing that this is a value we stand for, gender equality in WPS, but it also says something about how the functionality of our system. So it's not an add-on to societal preparedness or total defense or whatever. It is actually something about how we function. So how do we sort of, based on that idea, develop these more practical concepts without militarizing it to an extent that we do not promote also critical voices in these discussions?
Thank you, Louise, and thank you for these concrete suggestions. I very much agree, and I think also, of course, the Nordic countries do have a role to play in the future. I see that, unfortunately, we are running out of time. Perhaps I can hand the word over to Torunn and Inger, the co-editors of the special issue. If you want to say a few rounding off with a couple of words.
Well, I would just like to thank everyone who's been contributing to this webinar and to all those who've been listening in. I see that we have kept most of those who joined us from the very beginning until the very end. So I'm really grateful for that. And I don't know about you, but I am leaving this webinar with a lot of new ideas and thoughts about how we can take research and also more policy-oriented work further on, on women, peace and security. So thank you all.
Me as well. Thank you for, I have all of a sudden some problems with my screen here, so I may look a little strange, but thanks for really interesting interventions. There were a few comments actually which we didn't have time for, but I could just say that they all related to what you have addressed, which has to do with, how do we transform and how do we think about this agenda in the present, and the need to have much more of a domestic look at what WPS means in our respective countries and in the region. So just to say that based on the comments, the discussion was also spot on. But thank you, all of you, for your interventions, and thanks for everyone who listened. And I think it's safe to say that this will be continued, these debates.
Absolutely. And I think we will all of us here today continue to work on this in our respective country contexts, as well as perhaps interacting with each other, hopefully. At least I look very much forward to that. And I would also just like to thank everyone who listened in and all the panelists for contributing, and again, all the contributors to the special issue. It's been such a pleasure to do this work together, and hope we can continue our collaboration in the future and also discussions on this topic and related topics. So with that, we close, and thank you very much.